Welcome back to Notes on Process and Reality by Alfred North Whitehead. We are moving on to part 2 of the book. For the first chapter and the first and the second section, I did not feel the need to write a whole lot of notes. So for section 1, I wrote that the philosophy of organism is Neoplatonic. And for the second section, it was about faith and such. And I have a quote here. I wrote down, "Actuality is the decision amid potentiality." Now, to the real notes. Section 3. Any brute fact, a given, will fundamentally change the whole that was given. An additional given changes everything that is given. That is, a drop of red paint totally changes the perception of a blue painting of the ocean and blue sky. A hypothetical painting, let's say. While the future is indeterminate, the present is in fact determined, or satisfied. Moving on to section 4. Beyond any occasion of concrescence, there is, quote, the final reaction of the self-creative unity of the universe. This final reaction completes the self-creative act by putting the decisive stamp of creative emphasis upon the determinations of effective cause. End of quote. The initial subjective aim is macrocosmic, while the final satisfaction of immediate experience is microcosmic. Section 5. A universal is that which can enter into the description of a particular. A particular is the opposite. It is described by universals. However, actual occasions cannot be described by universals, but only by particular other actual entities. Quote, thus every ... universal is particular in the sense of being just what it is ... and every ... particular is universal in the sense of entering into the constitutions of other actual entities. End quote. I wrote down that universals and particulars are two sides of the same coin. Section 6. The four main objects are eternal objects, propositions, actual entities or actual occasions, and nexus. Since the classical notions of universals and particulars are problematic, the organic philosophy, with its doctrine of prehensions, explain how actual entities enter into the constitution of other actual entities, while the subject-predicate dogma that plagues the tradition of philosophy fails to explain. Section 7. A philosophical school of thought has, quote, performed its full service to philosophy, unquote, when it has realized its, quote, two presiding philosophers. These two men are, 1. The one who survey experience with some adequacy, but inconsistently, end quote, and the other one who puts the theory through purifying it of inconsistency. I wrote down in my own words, this reductio ad absurdum calls forth a re-evaluation for a greater claim of adequacy. Thus, a new school is born. Quote, change is the description of the adventures of eternal objects in the evolving universe of actual things. End quote. A real essence, or an actual essence, is the essence of actual entities. An abstract essence is an eternal complex object. Chapter 2. The extensive relations of space is consciously aware through ordinary perception. Quote, this mode of perception is here termed presentational immediacy. End quote. Actual entities objectifying themselves as they objectify other actual entities. That is, touching a chair objectifies the chair that you feel and your hand that you feel and probe. Quote, when we perceive a contemporary extended shape, which we term a chair, the sense data involved are not necessarily elements in the real internal constitution of this chair image. they are rather elements in some way of feeling in the real internal constitutions of those antecedent organs of the human body with which we perceive the chair. In my own words, I said, so the organs takes in the chair to its constitution. With this we perceive the chair. Section 2. Presentational immediacy presupposes two metaphysical assumptions. There are two meanings of potentiality. A. General potentiality is the absolute totality of anything that could be. And B. Real potentiality is the potentiality of the next unfolding moment. The continuum, or merely the potentiality for division, is where actual entities find their location in the actual world. As the world unfolds, actual entities negotiate their actuality with other actual occasions. And this clearing of the metaphysical agora, as like how I like to put it, forms the data for the actual entity to arise towards a novel standpoint. Quote, but in another sense, it is everywhere throughout the continuum, for its constitution includes the continuum. End of quote. Meaning to say, just like how I am myself qua the first person, I am also myself qua the second and third person. Likewise, any actual entity possesses the same quas, the same nature. Quote, extension, apart from its spatialization and temporalization, is that general scheme of relationships providing the capacity that many objects can be welded into the real unity of one experience. End quote. Quote, extension is the most general scheme of real potentiality. End quote. More general than space-time. Space-time is an actual enjoyment, not a potential enjoyment. Extension is the potential of space-time. Zeno's paradox violates the ontological principle. The initial subjective aim must be included in the whole process of becoming. Otherwise, how can subjective form refer to any actuality? The initial subjective aim is indivisible, and so any whole must be whole. The objective datum must sit with present actual occasions. Section 3. Kant is cringe. That's all I had to write about it. Section 4. Spinoza made the Cartesian philosophy more internally consistent, but in doing so he made it more farther away from the organic philosophy. Quote, Descartes and Locke permitted their substances to undergo adventures of changing qualifications and thereby create difficulties. End quote. Quote, I think, therefore I am. End quote. Of course, that's the Descartes line. This is Descartes' implicit organic philosophy showing because experience is held as the primary type of actual entity. Section 5. Substance ontology debunked. That's all I had to write for that. Section 6. More critiquing old dead philosophers. I guess I didn't feel the need to write much about that either. Chapter 3, Section 1. Quote, no actual entity can rise beyond what the actual world as a datum from its standpoint, its actual world, allows it to be, end quote. Order is the, quote, introduction of adaptation for the attainment of an end quote. The end being the furtherance of intensity of experience, driven by the divine appetition. Since actual entities are little shitheads, that's what I wrote down, who won't perfectly follow God's plan, along with every other creature besides God, there is disorder along with order in every becoming of actual entities. Simply, intensification is not fully optimized. During the Christian Middle Ages, they overstressed final causes. And during the modern scientific period, they overstressed efficient causes. Quote, satisfaction provides the individual element in the composition of an actual entity. Order and satisfaction are generic terms, meaning whatever the order or satisfaction is to one particular actual entity is unique and specific to them. Quote, no actual entity can be conscious of its own satisfaction. End of quote. Because the satisfaction is an outcome of the concrescence, it is a part, sorry, it is not a part of the concrescence. Therefore, the actual entity died before it felt its own satisfaction. But this all happens all at once, anyways, so we shall not over literalize these phases of concrescence. How an actual entity feels the data of the past is its original contribution to the creation of the world. Quote, the concrescence absorbing the derived data into immediate privacy synthesize ... the breath of feeling which creates a new fact has an origination not wholly traceable to the data. It conforms to the data in that it feels the data, but the how of feeling, though it is germane to the data, is not fully determined by the data. End quote. How the actual entity reacts to the data is its inclusion or exclusion of subjective forms. Hume makes a helpful observation about color. If you were familiar enough with colors in general, and if you were to imagine a new shade of blue, it illustrates that, quote, ideas are not always derived from the correspondent impressions, end quote, or now called data of objectifications. The graduation of eternal objects is felt as a lure, which is why you can imagine a new shade of blue without ever experiencing it. The shade has such a close relevance to your knowledge of blue that it is easily felt. God does not have a past because he is primordial. Quote, the primordial nature of God is the concrescence of a unity of conceptual feelings. End quote. Quote, the consequent nature of God is the physical prehension by God of the actualities of the evolving universe. End quote. Quote, the superjective nature of God is the character of the pragmatic value of his specific satisfaction, qualifying the transcendent creativity in the various temporal instances. Quote, or end quote, I mean. But, quote, the philosophy of organism is the inversion of Kant's philosophy. End quote. Wow, that was all one section. Section 2. Quote, the members of the society are alike because, by reason of their common character, they impose on other members of the society the conditions which led to that likeness. End quote. Quote, the world of actual entities is to be conceived as forming a background in layers of social order. End quote. I wrote in my own words, the world is a society of many overlapping societies. Quote, the causal laws which dominate a social environment are the product of the defining characteristics of that society. End quote. The laws come into being from the members, and the members exist by reason of those laws, just like the economics of a free market. Since societies are constantly being born and perished, so do laws arise and gradually perish. Any dominance of laws is a cosmic epoch, the widest society relevant to us. Every actual entity has a transcendental nature by virtue of its novelty. Whitehead says Newton would have been surprised by quantum theory, while Plato would have expected it. Whitehead evokes Plato and Aristotle as affirming the realness of potentiality and of forms on page 96. Whitehead goes on to say Plato's Timaeus affirms the epoch theory of non-permanent laws. Section 4. Beyond our epoch is a vast nexus that envelops all other epochs. This ultimate society is pure extension. Our current epoch is dominated by electromagnetism. Our epoch society sits within a larger society, but still more specialized than the ultimate society, which is the geometric society. Our actual entities are electromagnetic occasions in our current epoch. Section 5. A living cell is a structured society to the subordinate society molecule inside the cell. A structured society is a relative term for a society qua structuring more special or subordinate societies within. Quote, but there may be other nexus included in a structured society which, expecting the general systematic characteristics of the external environment, present no features capable of genetically sustaining themselves apart from the special environment provided by that structured society. End quote. Such a nexus is no society and lacks any social features. It is termed a subordinate nexus. Members of a special form of society includes features which do not occur in analogous occasions in the external environment. Section 6. An unspecialized society can assume multiple roles in its environment. An unspecialized society is unable to increase intensity of satisfaction for its members. Section 7. By enhancing the mental pole, the society can elicit a massive average objectification of a nexus while eliminating diversity of details of the members. This will optimize structure and survival with unspecialization and intensity. Another solution to optimization is to, quote, receive the novel elements of the environment into explicit feelings with such subjective forms as consolidate them with the complex experiences proper to members of the structured society. End quote. This is an initiative of the initial subjective aim. This second solution is what organisms use, while inorganic objects use the first one. Quote, the primary meaning of life is the origination of conceptual novelty. End quote. Section 8. Higher organisms all have inorganic societies, as far as we know. Section 9. Quote, endurance is a device whereby an occasion is peculiarly bound by a single line of physical ancestry. End quote. Section 10. We can call what a society does when it breaks down another society into simpler social elements and integrates it into itself as eating food. Again, God seeks to maximize intensity of experience. So, casualties for the sake of food is necessary for God's advancement. Section 11. What's called an entirely living nexus lacks the genetic power which belongs to societies. However, it can have a personal order and become a living person. Hybrid prehensions are the prehensions by one subject of an impure prehension belonging to the mentality of another subject. There is diversity of centralization of will and agency amongst organisms. Chapter 4. Triviality is the lack of coordination in the factors of the datum. There is a failure to elicit depth of feelings from contrast because there is an excess of incompatible differentiation in the datum. Vagueness is a deficiency in supplementary feeling discriminating objects of the datum from each other. Quote, a group of actual entities, and their sporadic differences of character have sunk into comparative irrelevance, besides the one character belonging to the whole and any of its parts. End of quote. Whitehead speaks of a two-layered background for actual entities. First is one of systematic uniformity, and the second one is of triviality and vagueness, aka chaos. Or triviality is chaos and vagueness is uniformity. That's what I wrote down my notes. Section 2. Kant and Hume assume a radical disconnect of impressions qua data. Borrowing from Henry Bergson, sense reception is unspatialized and sense perception is spatialized. It is sense of emotion versus sense of space. Section 3. Sensa, or sensum, are the lowest category of eternal objects. They do not intrinsically relate to any particular object, but they are needed to realize higher grades of eternal objects. It shares a common characteristic with any other eternal object, quote, that it introduces the notion of the logical variable in both forms, the unselective any and the selective some, end of quote. Section 4. An actual entity of the simplest grade is unoriginative in their response to the datum with its simple content of sensa. Section 5. Human experience, specifically perception, quote, is the inclusion in the datum of the objectification of an antecedent part of the human body, end of quote. The human eye is the datum for the human ego. Quote, the predominant basis of perception is perception of the various bodily organs as passing on their experiences by channels of transmission and of enhancement. End of quote. The experience of an actual entity, relevantly a part of the human body, is transmitted, quote, to one or more central occasions to be inherited with enhancements occurring upon the way, or finally added by reason of the final integration. The enduring personalities is the historic route of living occasions which are severely dominant in the body at successive instances. End of quote. Section 6. Perception is perception of the settled world in the past because it takes time for your human experience to be transmitted to you by all your actual occasions. Memory is a mode of perception. Quote, for memory is perception relating to the data from some historic route of ultimate precipitant subjects. End quote. Section 7. That was what Whitehead calls perception in the mode of causal efficacy. There is another sense what we mean by perception, that being perception in the mode of presentational immediacy, which is the rescuing from vagueness a contemporary spatial region by means of a sensum. For example, the mere sight of a common gray stone is confined to the illustration of the geometrical perspective relatedness of the spatial region to the precipitant by the mediation of gray. The sensum gray rescues that region from its vague conclusion with other regions. These two modes is highly complex to untangle from each other, and philosophy has had a great difficulty in doing so. Symbolic reference is the interplay between these two modes. If we were to perceive the stone in a mirror, we would have a pure presentational immediacy of the stone without its perception of its causal efficacy. Section 8. In the causal mode, the present is negatively defined as neither the historic route of the past inherited, nor the potential future ahead. The presentational mode is positively defined by itself as being the present information mediated by a sensum. Section 9. There are two different locuses for actual entities. Locus or loci are not words I'm familiar with, by the way, so I'm assuming it means location. Chapter 5. Now we're going to talk about Locke and Hume. Section 1. David Hume's theory of simple and complex impressions and ideas fails because the imagination is not free absolutely. Section 2. Hume fails to justify cause and effect with his metaphysics and basically gave up and copes with saying it's just practical to believe in cause and effect. Quote, Hume has confused a repetition of impressions with an impressions of repetitions of impressions. End quote. Hume's problem with cause and effect is that it is not given by memory or impressions, but the reason why he thinks so is because his theory of memories is dogshit. To David Hume, the difference between impressions, memories, and ideas is the degree of force and viscosity. Basically, the vibes seem like this is the ordering of superiority. Impressions, memories, and ideas. It omits the essence of memory, which involves repetition. Section 3. Quote, Hume's argument has become circular. End quote. His argument is that ideas are derived from impressions, which is an empirical observation, but he disregards repetition as an impression. Section 4. The subject-predicate dogma emphasize absolute truth over relational truth. Substances are independently true instead of occasions interdependently true. We find our modern subject-predicate dogma with the scholastics, or the medieval philosophers, climaxing with Descartes. We find the start of a revolt with John Locke and David Hume. Quote, in the philosophy of organism, a subject-predicate proposition is considered as expressing a high abstraction, end quote. The Lockean notion of ideas and its principle that ideas are determined to particular existence is what Whitehead wants to salvage from Lockeanism. Hume abandons this principle in the name of making Lockeanism more consistent. Whitehead aims to abandon what is inconsistent with this principle. Section 5. Hume's skepticism, on the other hand, quote, is nothing but the discovery that there is something in the world which cannot be expressed in analytic propositions, end quote. In contrast to Locke, Locke holds an inconsistency of abstract ideas being merely the measures of species. Therefore, a point goes to Hume. Ideas to Locke and Hume, and the soul to Hume, are replaced with actual occasions in the philosophy of organism. Both philosophers suffer from both a confusion between ideas of sensation and ideas of reflection, and a confusion of the hierarchy of emotions and sensations. As opposed to Locke and Hume, the organic philosophy holds that emotions are more primitive. Chapter 6. Now we're going to talk about Descartes and Immanuel Kant. To René Descartes, a quality was either an accident or an essential attribute. A substance was predicated on the essential attribute. Descartes held three types of change to be true. First was the change of accidents, then the birth of a substance, and last was the death of a substance. Whitehead says experience is the, quote, self-employment of being one among many and of being one arising out of the composition of many, end quote. René Descartes says experience is the, quote, self-employment by an individual substance of its qualifications by ideas, end quote. Section 2. While in Locke's essay is not concerned with metaphysics, the implied metaphysics of the first two books of the essay is more sensationalist, while the latter one diverges towards something more organic. While Hume was more concerned with the first two books, Whitehead is more concerned with the third and final book. Section 3. An actual entity is a composite, or it is assumed to be. I thought it was strange that Whitehead had to say it was assumed to be. The principle of intensive relevance. Any item in the universe has its own gradation of relevance in the constitution of any actual entity, including negative prehensions. Somehow, gradations of relevance between two items result in the lack of potency of two coexistence. I wrote down what the hell does that mean. Quote, eternal objects express how the predecessor phase is absorbed into the successor phase without limitation of itself. End quote. Whitehead reminds us eternal objects do not come from non-being into being, but rather from indetermination into determination. Thus, Whitehead reaffirms the realism of potency while also putting potency in its rightful subordinates to actuality. Now, in my notes, it says to refer to the very helpful paragraph. So starting at the bottom of page 149, we're going to go through a very long quote. So, this is all Whitehead's words. The four stages constitutive of an actual entity have been stated above in Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 1. They can be named datum, process, satisfaction, and decision. The two terminal stages have to do with becoming in the sense of the transition from the settled actual world to the new actual entity relatively to which that settlement is defined. But such definition must be found as an element in the actual entities concerned. The settlement which an actual entity finds is its datum. It is to be conceived as a limited perspective of the settled world provided by the eternal objects concerned. This datum is decided by the settled world. It is prehended by the new superseding entity. The datum is the objective content of the experience. The decision providing the datum is a transference of self-limited appetition. The settled world provides the real potentiality that its many actualities be felt compatibly, and the new concrescence starts from this datum. The perspective is provided by the elimination of incompatibilities. The final stage, the decision, is how the actual entity, having attained its individual satisfaction, thereby adds a determinate condition to the settlement for the future beyond itself. Thus, the datum is the decision received, and the decision is the decision transmitted. Between these two decisions, received and transmitted, there lie the two stages, process and satisfaction. The datum is indeterminate as regards to the final satisfaction. The process is the addition of those elements of feeling, whereby these indeterminations are dissolved into determinate linkages, attaining the actual unity of an individual actual entity. The actual entity, in becoming itself, also solves the question as to what it is to be. Thus, process is the stage in which the creative idea works towards the definition and attainment of a determined individuality. Process is the growth and attainment of a final end. The progressive definition of the final end is the efficacious condition for its attainment. The determinate unity of an actual entity is bound together by the final causation towards an ideal progressively defined by its progressive relation to the determinations and indeterminations of the datum. The ideal itself felt defines what self shall arise from the datum, and the ideal is also an element in the self which thus arises. To wrap up section 3, I have to say that causation is actual entities in process to the succeeding entity. And I have a quote here. Quote, thought is a constituent operation in the creation of the occasional thinker. Section 4, Locke, Hume, and Kant suffer from the primacy of consciousness. They conceive the problem to be of mental operations instead of actual entities. Section 5. Process is, quote, the admission of eternal objects in their new role of investing the datum with the individuality of the subject, end quote. Substance philosophy is subject that encounters a datum and reacts to the datum, but process philosophy is the datum felt and progressively attains the unity of the subject. The datum for Kant is, quote, the end of Kant's process and thus takes the place of satisfaction in the process as analyzed in the philosophy of organism, end quote. Whitehead affirms the order of objectivity into subjectivity, and then perishing into objectivity against the Kantian order of the exact opposite. Chapter 7, Section 1. The subjectivist principle, quote, the datum in the act of experience can be adequately analyzed purely in terms of universal, end of quote. That is the subjectivist principle. The sensationalist principle, quote, the primary activity in the act of experience is the bare subjective entertainment of the datum, devoid of any subjective form of reception, end of quote. Whitehead accepts a reformed version of the subjectivist principle, but utterly rejects the sensationalism. Hume embraces both. Kant embraces the subjectivist principle, but not the sensationalist principle. And Locke embraces the sensationalist principle, but was inconsistent for the subjectivist principle. Substance quality is quality inhering a substance. A primary substance is always a subject and never a predicate, and that the experienced subject is a primary substance. Thus, universals and particulars are denied because these premises are denied in the philosophy of organism and are replaced with actual entities, the particulars, and eternal objects, the universals. Rene Descartes, quote, increased the metaphysical emphasis on the substance quality forms of thought, end of quote. But he also established subjects enjoying conscious experience are themselves primary data for the enjoyment. In doing so, Locke and Hume embark on the doomed project of compatibilism between subjective enjoyment and substance dogma. Whitehead aims to save subjective enjoyment as the primary data to do metaphysics by integrating it in his process metaphysics. Thus, he has a reformed subjectivist principle. Moving on to section 2. Consciousness enjoyed by you and me, but not actual entities, is the feeling of negation or negative prehension slash perception. And I believe I made a mistake. It is enjoyed by actual entities. That was just a mistake in my notes. Section 3. The primitive of experience is emotions. Section 4. God grades the entire multiplicity of eternal objects for each stage of concrescence. Every actual entity is gifted a curated selection of novelties to play around with. Conformal, conceptual, and comparative feelings make up the three successive phases of feelings. Propositional feelings are included in comparative feelings. Conformal feelings are the how you feel. These three species make up 3 out of the 4 modes of ingressions eternal objects traverse. The fourth mode is when an eternal object is functioning datively, whereby it presents data for prehension by actual entities, as it was once born into this world in its first concrescence, but has perished into the past. The second and third mode is called the supplemental phase. Quote, the conformal stage merely transforms the objective content into subjective feelings, but the supplementary stage adds or excludes the realization of the contrast by which the original datum passes into its emotional unity. End quote. This is the realization of novelty in feelings. However, this is not the true essence of the supplementary stage. Rather, its essence is adjustment of subjective importance by functioning of subjective origin. Consciousness is a prolongation of the supplemental phase. Whitehead speaks of 2 dimensions of the superject. The dimension of narrowness refers to the intensities of individual emotions arising out of the individual components in the datum. End quote. The dimension of width is the subordination of the former dimension into coordination of deepening the ocean of feelings. That's how Whitehead referred to it as the deepening the oceans of feelings. Section 5. The reformed subjectivist principle is also the same principle of relativity established in Part 1. Whitehead re-expresses the reformed subjectivist principle as, quote, that apart from the experiences of subjects, there is nothing, 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 bare nothingness. End quote. Chapter 8. Quote, presentational immediacy gives no information as to the past or the future, ... It thereby defines a cross-section of the universe. End quote. Symbolic reference is the mixed mode of perception of interplay between the two pure modes, them being the element of the data in presentational immediacy and the element of potency in presentational immediacy. Common ground is the shared identicalness of components in experience in each of the pure modes. A characteristic of some of the more advanced organisms, like humans, is to error based on misinterpretation of the mixed mode of perception. Quote, the present locus is directly illustrated by the sensa. End quote. Therefore, the past and the future are only indirectly perceived. Quote, the present locus is a common ground for the symbolic reference because it is directly and distinctly perceived in presentational immediacy. End quote. Section 2. Now Whitehead begins with a second common ground for symbolic reference. The second common ground is, quote, the connection between the two modes affected by the identity of an eternal object integrated in both of them. End quote. The former ground being, quote, the extensive region, end quote, enjoying a, quote, diversity of eternal objects, end quote. The latter ground being a diversity of regions mixed with now just one eternal object. It's really hard for me to understand. If you have any questions, tell me down in the comments below, and I will be sure to not answer them, because I don't know what the fuck's going on. In the presentational immediacy of a gray stone, the gray is the eternal object sensum, and the stone is the historic route in the past. Presentational immediacy arises in the later phases of concrescence due to its originative nature, or the sensa. The perceptive mode of causal efficacy belongs even to the lowest grade of organisms, but presentational immediacy is a privilege afforded to some of the higher grades, like humans. Presentational immediacy makes, quote, what was vague, ill-defined, and hardly relevant in causal efficacy becomes distinct, well-defined, and importantly relevant in presentational immediacy. End quote. Presentational immediacy enhances the importance of relationships which were already in the datum. Section 3. For David Hume and Immanuel Kant, presentational immediacy was the primary fact of perception. Alfred North Whitehead rejects this. For Whitehead, apprehension is primary. Now, I have some words of my own to talk about this. Whitehead calls it the primacy of presentational immediacy. I find it odd that this is pretty much the same Morandian expression of the primacy of consciousness. Likewise, one can translate the Randian primacy of existence into the primacy of apprehension. Now, moving on. Whitehead blames Hume's attack on causation on his dogma of presentational immediacy. Hume explains his nonsense away by appealing to habit. Whitehead rightfully points this out as a sleight of hand, for habit is a feeling too, so why not causation? Moving on to section 4. Quote, our bodily experience is primarily an experience of the dependence of presentational immediacy upon causal efficacy. Hume's doctrine inverts this relationship by making causal efficacy as an experience dependent on presentational immediacy. End of quote. Now, I have my own words to speak about this. I am curious as to why it's merely primarily. Wouldn't it be always absolutely true that presentational immediacy is always dependent on what came before? Nevertheless, Whitehead correctly notes how nonsense it is for Hume to put the burden on experience to find causation, as if something can come from nothing. To separate causation from experience would be like separating the ground from walking. Walking is walking on ground, and experience is experience of the caused. Alfred North Whitehead discerns 4 grades of actual entities. There are occasions in empty space, occasions in the life histories of enduring non-living objects, such as electrons. There are actual entities in the life histories of living enduring objects, and then ones with conscious knowledge. Rest and motion, also known as presented duration, is intelligible and negligible to the first and lowest grade of actual occasions. The second grade gains a limited feeling of duration. The third grade is less limited to the point of occasions feeling the need to self-preserve via what Whitehead calls symbolic transference. The last grade enjoys the freedom of imagination and conceptual functionings. Now, I have some ideas of my own. If I may add a 5th grade to separate myself from my pet cat, the 5th grade elevates the animal conceptual functionings into obtaining a repertoire of ever self-creating abstractions as a toolbox of psychotechnologies, such as now language in economies are possible. And I also have another thought. What grade is God? If God is an actual occasion, or I guess Whitehead says he should be referred to as an actual entity and not an occasion because he is eternal, what grade is he? I'm assuming he's going to be the lowest grade. And if he's the lowest grade, that means God is unconscious. And if God's unconscious, I guess he's more like the Force from Star Wars. And I'm assuming he is the lowest grade since he is eternal, so that means he must be primitive, that he was always here. So I guess it would be the first original lowest grade. But I don't know. Whether or not he is like the first and lowest grade, or he is some other grade, or whatever, if he even is the first and lowest grade, it obviously would be very different from any other lowest grade actual occasion, since God enjoys omnipotent knowledge, since he has an eternal life history, or historic route. Section 5. Whitehead reiterates presentational immediacy affords information about the percepta in the mode of causal efficacy, unlike David Hume and Kant, who believe in the opposite. Symbolic reference is chiefly the elucidation of percepta in the causal mode as primary. The causal mode is a very emotional mode, and presentational immediacy is cold facts. Symbolic reference accepts percepta from presentational immediacy as evidence for work in the mode of efficacy. Presentational immediacy belongs in the supplemental phase, while the causal mode belongs in the responsive phase. Both modes are united under symbolic reference. Moving on to section 6. Whitehead says symbolism governs symbolic reference. Symbolism is 2 species of percepta, symbols and meanings, which share common ground in symbolic reference or of relatedness. Symbolism is either unjustified or justified, tested by what is pragmatic. Chapter 9, Section 1, quote, "A living occasion is characterized by a flash of novelty among the appetitions of its mental pole." End of quote. Appetition can be identified as either a pure or an impure conceptual prehension, the impure being the integrations with physical prehensions from the physical pole, and the infinity of eternal objects serving as a datum for pure conceptual prehensions. The datum for the impure conceptual prehensions being propositions or theories. This is not to say the impure is the integration of physical and conceptual prehensions. Rather, it is to say what could be actualized in any given moment are the impure potentials and not the pure potentials. A physical purpose is the specialized appetition for impure potentials, either as aversion or adversion, turning away or turning towards. Propositional prehensions are prehensions of theories. Whitehead corrects logicians on the nature of propositions. Logicians limit proposition to either true or false. Common sense tells us the phrase from Hamlet, "to be or not to be," lacks this dichotomy. This example rather illustrates the aesthetic delight of propositions without judgment value. Whitehead points out how the Napoleon victory of Waterloo that never took place still is part of the constitution of our world. We know this because alternative history theorists draw upon what did not happen to theorize, which is why Alternative History Hub makes viral videos on Napoleon and fantastic alternative history on YouTube. What alternative theorists draw upon is propositions and not eternal objects as primary. Quote, "A general proposition only differs from a singular proposition by the generalization of one definite set of actual entities into any set belonging to a certain sort of sets. If the sort of sets includes all sets with potentiality for that nexus of reactions, the proposition is called universal." End of quote. Quote, "The definite set of actual entities involved are called the logical subjects of the proposition, and the definite set of eternal objects involved are called the predicates of the proposition. The predicates define a potentiality of relatedness for the subjects." End of quote. The predicate forms an eternal object called the complex predicate. The singular proposition is the potential for the actualization of ingression for this eternal object. Whitehead notes three possible life paths of an actual entity. Either the succeeding occasion has a conformal transformation, a non-conformal transformation, or no transformation, aka either stagnation, growth, or decay. These transformations are caused by either a lack of contrasting feelings, admission of contrast, or elimination of all dominant elements of feeling. Quote, "A feeling contrary is consciousness in germ." End of quote. Contrast is contrast of mere theory and mere fact. Entertainment by admission into feeling is the primary mode of realization, not truth judgment for a proposition. There are four types of entities. Two are primary: actual occasions, eternal objects, feelings, and propositions. Moving on to section 2. Anyone who admit a disjunction between introspection and extrospection of experience will suffer in their metaphysics and epistemology. Anyone who refuses to have further interpretation of the term togetherness beyond the primary interpretation of the wholeness of experience suffers from the non-reformed subjectivist doctrine. Whitehead affirms we may abstract from experiential meaning and create alternative meanings. Kant suffers from all of the above. The truthhood or falsehood of a proposition is called correspondence, and the correctness, incorrectness, or suspension of judgment of propositions is called coherence. Section 3. A relation between actual entities is an eternal object. Quote, a general principle is an eternal object which is only illustrated through its instances, which are also eternal objects. Dot dot dot. The instances each involve the general principle, but the general principle only involves at least one instance. Dot dot dot. For example, color is a general principle and colors are the instances. End of quote. A relation can be dual, triple, quad, etc., etc., etc. This means a dual relation is when the nexus in which it is realized consists of two and only two actual entities. A nexus is an indicative system once it A is a dual relation, B instances of a general principle, and C and D, it says that I need to refer to page 194 and 195. So I guess we're going to quote Whitehead again. C. The relation in the system between any member alpha and any other member beta does not also relate alpha and a member of the nexus other than beta. And D. The relations in the system between alpha and beta and between alpha and Charlie suffice to define the relation in the system between beta and Charlie, where alpha, beta, and Charlie are any three members of the nexus. End of quote. Quote, every proposition presupposes some general nexus with an indicative relational system. End of quote. Quote, propositions is the potentiality of the objectification of certain presupposed actual entities via certain qualities and relations. End of quote. Section 4. Metaphysical proposition is a proposition which holds meaning for any actual entity entertained by a subject, is general, and has a uniform truth value identically equal amongst all the relevant singular propositions. No cosmic epoch can contradict in truth value of a metaphysical proposition from a previous cosmic epoch. Section 5. Probability is not inherently statistical. There is yet another way to grasp probability. And also, for fun fact, apparently Whitehead says that his theory of probability is inspired by the famous pedophile John Maynard Keynes. So, for the Austrians listening to this, that's an interesting fact, I guess. Section 6. The ultimate ground on which probability rests upon is the presupposed environment inherited in the life history of an occasion. That presupposition is the maintenance of order, which statistics depend upon. Knowing an actual entity is knowing its order. Knowing this, we can estimate its future. Induction, quote, is the derivation of some characteristics of a particular future from the known characteristics of a particular past. And that quote is actually from the 1925 book, Science in the Modern World. Whitehead was just using it as an example here in this book. Now moving on to section 7. Quote, any inductive argument always includes a hypothesis, namely, that the environment which is the subject matter considered contains a society of actual occasions analogous to a society in the present. End of quote. The current epoch supplies us the basis for a statistical explanation of probability, but any epoch is too big to not need a sample of the epoch's data. A non-arbitrary method of sampling is required. It is to be found in the primary phase of the most relevant actual entities. Section 8. Each actual entity springs into the environment from the base of its own constitution. The environment is one definite form from a multiplicity of indefinite possible environments. There is a presupposition of species of actual entities, and it involves a presupposition concerning the environment. There is also a presupposition of some general type of environment. Quote, Thus, the basis of all probability and induction is the fact of analogy between an environment presupposed and an environment directly experienced. End of quote. The non-statistical judgment of probability is of graduated intensive relevance. Thanks to God and his gifting of gradients of appetites, there can be an intuition of an intrinsic suitability of some definite outcome from a presupposed situation. Moving on to Chapter 10, Section 1. Quote, that all things flow is the first vague generalization which the unsystematized, barely analyzed intuition of men has produced. End of quote. Truly, Heraclitus was cooking. From Hebrew poetry to Greek philosophy to Eastern philosophy, the flux is our oldest elucidation of experience. Quote, Plato found his permanence in a static, spiritual heaven, and his flux in the entanglement of his forms amid the fluent imperfections of the physical world. ... Aristotle corrected his Platonism. ... He makes a mastery analysis of the notion of generation. Aristotle in his own person expressed a useful protest against the Platonic tendency to separate a static spiritual world from a fluent world of superficial experience. End of quote. Moving on to section 2. Concrescence is the process in which the universe of many enters into the constitution of one. Concrescence is the actual entity. There is never one complete set of actual entities because, quote, a set of all actual occasions is by the nature of things a standpoint for another concrescence which elicits a concrete unity from those many actual occasions. End of quote. Thus, the actual world is merely a relative term. Feelings are actual occasions, felt, eternal objects felt, feelings felt, and its own subjective forms of intensity. Section 3. The satisfaction standing on the responsive phase and the following supplemental phase is the evaporation of all indetermination. I really like that. I really like how he said that. The evaporation of all indetermination. This isn't a quote, by the way, but he did say evaporation of all indetermination. It is a determined attitude. The first phase is of pure reception, the second of incoming appetition. Section 4. The supplemental phase is comprised of two subordinate phases. The first concerns aesthetics, and the second concerns intellect. The aesthetic one is emotional evaluation or appreciation, which is an assumption of beauty and distaste. Quote, what was received as alien has been recreated as private. End of quote. The intellectual one brings intellectual sight or negates it to the blind passion of the previous subphase. What is accepted or dismissed is the realization of relevance of eternal objects, or lack thereof to actual fact. If dismissed, we have a blind actual occasion, lacking intellectual operations. We can find consciousness in this subphase. Section 5. The two species of process is the macroscopic process and the microscopic process. The former is attained actuality to actuality in attainment. The latter is conversions of conditions, aka teleology. Now, some closing thoughts. I have to say, if consciousness is found in the intellectual subphase of the supplemental phase, then the afterlife is the furtherance of us qua actual occasion, blind to the intelligence subphase, or the irrelevance of the phase as hyper-trivial. And if the aesthetic values we have built up in life finds furtherance qua actual occasion, then simply our aesthetic values penetrate onwards, blind in intellect because of the death of consciousness. This is, I guess, heaven or hell. You basically live on in what you have built up aesthetically in your values. Likewise, we can find the ego in the intellectual subphase because the ego is an abstraction. It is self-awareness. So this is sort of like the atheist non-afterlife, because the ego is gone. And likewise, the actual occasions will yet again find the intellectual subphase, for it has eternity on its side. Eventually, it will find it back, which is reincarnation. So Whitehead says consciousness is the prolongation of the supplemental phase. So basically, we are an actual occasion yet to perish while arising out of a body and in an environment of constantly perishing occasions. But you know what? I'll wrap it up for now. Um, Subscribe if you like to see more videos like this. We're gonna do part 3. Comment down below. If you have any questions, I probably won't answer them. I'm pretty much like 50% confused. I'm like 50% vibing, you know? I'm 50% confused. In my opinion, so far as I'm reading, um, Process and Reality, I agree that Whitehead is onto something, yet it's very hard to confirm the details of what he is saying is correct or not. But I do find it very entertaining. So, that'll be it for now. Thanks for watching.